The morning broke cold and clear over Asch, Belgium, on the first day of 1945. Captain John Meyer, commander of the 352nd Fighter Squadron, had just begun walking toward his P-51 Mustang when he heard it a sound that no Allied pilot expected to hear anymore. A low, thunderous roar, growing louder, not from above, from the horizon itself. When he looked up, his heart stopped. The sky was filled with German fighters. More than 900 Luftwaffe aircraft were descending on 17 Allied airfields across Belgium, the Netherlands, and France at that exact moment. It was 9:20 in the morning. The war in Europe had 16 weeks left to run, and the German Air Force was about to commit suicide. This is the story of Operation Bodenplatte, Operation Baseplate, the largest single-day air operation the Luftwaffe would ever mount, and the day that approximately 213 German pilots flew to their deaths in a desperate gamble that would leave their air force weaker than ever before. It is a story of meticulous planning destroyed by fatal miscommunication. Veteran pilots sacrificed a handful of burned aircraft, of a tactical success that became a strategic catastrophe. And it begins not on that cold New Year's morning, but 3 weeks earlier, in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. December 16th, 1944. German forces launched their final major offensive on the Western Front, the operation that would become known as the Battle of the Bulge. For the Wehrmacht, it was a desperate bid to split Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Americans and British to negotiate a separate peace. But the offensive had one critical requirement: air support. The Luftwaffe needed to protect German columns, attack Allied positions, and most importantly, keep Allied fighter bombers away from the advancing tanks. There was just one problem. By December of 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of the force that had terrorized Europe in 1940. Since the Normandy invasion 6 months earlier, Allied fighters had systematically driven German aircraft from the skies. The Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces operated with near impunity, attacking German positions, destroying supply lines, and shooting down any Luftwaffe plane foolish enough to challenge them. German fighter production remained high. Nearly 25,000 fighters had been built in 1944 alone, including 13,000 Messerschmitt Bf 109s and 7,500 Focke-Wulf FW-190s. But aircraft without pilots were useless, and pilots were exactly what the Luftwaffe lacked. The cream of German fighter aviation had been killed over the previous years. The Battle of Britain, the Eastern Front, the defense of the Reich against American bombers each had consumed irreplaceable veterans. By late 1944, many German fighter pilots were barely out of training, with perhaps 20 or 30 hours of flight time before being thrown into combat against Allied pilots who had hundreds of hours and dozens of kills. As Colonel Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe ace with 176 victories, put it bluntly, "We were assigned young pilots who were timid, inexperienced and scared, and not yet ready for combat." But the Ardennes offensive demanded air support, and Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, promised to deliver it. For months, he had been carefully husbanding fighter resources, pulling aircraft away from Reich defense to build up strength on the Western Front. By mid-December, he had assembled approximately 2,400 tactical aircraft, the largest concentration of German air power in the West since 1940. When the ground offensive began on December 16th, the Luftwaffe flew more than 500 sorties on the first 2 days, providing close air support and attacking Allied positions. Then the weather closed in. The same thick fog and low clouds that prevented Allied air forces from supporting their ground troops also grounded most Luftwaffe operations. For a few precious days, German tanks advanced without interference from the air, but the reprieve was temporary. On December 23rd, the weather began to clear. The Allied air forces returned in overwhelming strength, thousands of fighters and bombers that turned the Ardennes roads into killing grounds. German columns were strafed, bombed, and destroyed. the offensive ground to a halt, and the Luftwaffe paid a terrible price. Between December 17th and December 27th, German fighter units lost more than 600 aircraft. Over 300 pilots were killed. On December 5th, in a single engagement over Berlin, the Luftwaffe had lost 75 pilots, 53 of them killed, including a group commander and 2 squadron leaders. The Americans lost 5 planes. On Christmas Eve, the United States 8th Air Force sent the largest mission in its history against Luftwaffe bases on the Western Front. 2,034 bombers escorted by 700 fighters, followed by more than 1,200 British Spitfires, Tempests, and Typhoons. The Germans lost 106 aircraft and 85 pilots. On Christmas Day, they lost 62 more planes and 49 pilots. On December 26th, another 60 aircraft and 49 pilots were gone. By the end of December, the carefully hoarded fighter force had been bled white. The Ardennes offensive had failed. Operation Northwind, a second ground offensive in Alsace, was struggling, and the Luftwaffe was weaker than it had been in months. That Goering decided to gamble everything on one last throw of the dice. The plan was conceived by General Major Dietrich Peltz, a veteran Stuka dive bomber pilot with extensive experience in ground attack operations from Poland, France, and the Eastern Front. Peltz's idea was audacious in its simplicity. Mass every available fighter on the Western Front for a single, overwhelming strike against Allied airfields. Destroy their aircraft on the ground where they couldn't fight back. Cripple their air power before they could interfere with German ground forces. Win back, if only temporarily, the air superiority that the Luftwaffe had lost. The operation was planned with meticulous care. On December 15th, Peltz worked out the details with the Luftwaffe's fighter wing commanders, Gotthard Handrick, Walter Grabmann, and Karl Henschel. 17 Allied airfields were selected as targets, spread across Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. Careful routes were plotted to avoid Allied defences. The attack would be made at dawn, just after first light, flying at 150 feet above the ground to stay beneath Allied radar coverage. Junkers Ju-88 and Ju-188 night fighters would serve as pathfinders, dropping flares to guide the largely inexperienced fighter pilots to their targets. Every aircraft would attack at exactly the same moment, 9:20 in the morning, on the designated day to achieve complete surprise. The operation was originally scheduled for December 16th, to support the opening of the Ardennes offensive. But the same miserable weather that kept Allied planes grounded also prevented the German attack. Day after day, Peltz waited for the skies to clear. Meanwhile, the code words were distributed. Varus meant the operation would launch within 24 hours. Teutonicus authorized commanders to brief their pilots and prepare aircraft. Hermann, supposedly for Hermann Goering, gave the exact date and time. Dorothea indicated a delay. Spetlazy late harvest meant cancellation after formations were already airborne. Secrecy was absolute. Peltz knew that if word leaked to the Allies, the entire operation would fail. So tight was operational security that not even all German ground forces were informed. Anti-aircraft batteries along the flight paths had no idea that hundreds of friendly aircraft would soon be flying overhead. This decision would have catastrophic consequences. Finally, on December 31st, the weather forecast showed clear skies for the morning of January 1st. At airfields across western Germany, the code word went out: Hermann, tomorrow morning, 9:20. Ground crews worked through the final night of 1944, preparing every flyable aircraft. Pilots were roused from their quarters at 0500 hours, no New Year's celebrations for them, no alcohol, no parties. They ate a quick breakfast, then gathered for their final briefings. Only now did most of them learn their targets. 19-year-old Sergeant Werner Molge would never forget his arrival at the airfield that morning. When we turned in at the field, he later recalled, a fantastic sight spread out in front of our eyes. The aircraft of all the Staffeln had been taxied from their dispersals by the ground crews and were lined up at the field, as if for parade inspection. 54 190D-9s in the last light of the moon. 50 fighters, just one group. Multiply that by the dozens of fighter units preparing to launch, and the scale becomes clear. In all, approximately 1,035 aircraft were being readied for Operation Bodenplatte, roughly 900 fighters and fighter bombers, with the remainder being Pathfinder night fighters. The aircraft types were varied but deadly. 38.5% were Messerschmitt Bf 109s, the backbone of German fighter aviation since the Spanish Civil War. 38.5% were Focke-Wulf Fairview 190A models, rugged radial engine fighters that had proven themselves as both interceptors and ground attack aircraft. 23% were the new Fevelu 190D models, the Dora, with an inline engine that gave superior high-altitude performance. These were good aircraft, flown by a mixture of veteran survivors and untested novices. The veterans knew this was likely a one-way mission. The novices didn't know enough to be properly terrified. At 08:22 hours on January 1st, 1945, the first aircraft lifted off from Gütersloh Airfield in Westphalia. Across western Germany, the sky filled with the roar of hundreds of engines. The Pathfinder Ju-88s took off first, their navigators setting course for Belgium and the Netherlands. Behind them, wave after wave of fighters climbed into the cold morning air, forming up into loose formations. Then they dropped to 150 feet and turned west. At this altitude, German pilots hadn't dared fly over formerly occupied territory in daylight for months. Allied fighters owned the sky. But on this morning, the Germans flew in such overwhelming strength that Allied fighters couldn't stop them even if they tried, and the element of surprise was total. British signals intelligence had detected unusual German air activity in recent days, but had no idea an operation of this scale was imminent. Allied airfields were completely unprepared. The armada roared across the German border at treetop level. Some formations stayed tightly together, following their pathfinders. Others became scattered in the morning haze. Navigation at such low altitude was difficult, and many young pilots had never flown this deep into Allied territory. Some groups missed their targets entirely and attacked the wrong airfields. Others got lost and had to abort. But most found their way. Corporal Geoffrey Cooke, a British radar technician manning the top of a lighthouse on Walcheren Island in the Scheldt River, watched in astonishment as hordes of planes flying towards the Belgian coast. They passed on both sides, and many were nearer the ground than my perch. I shall always remember that grandstand view of the last major effort of the Luftwaffe. At RAF bases across the Low Countries, ground crews were going about their morning routines. At Eindhoven in the Netherlands, Hawker Typhoon squadrons were preparing for their early missions. The airfield had been a permanent Luftwaffe base before its hasty evacuation in September of 1944, and it was well equipped with brick buildings, dispersed taxiways, and earthen revetments. Leading aircraftsman Desmond Shepard, an armourer with No. 137 Squadron, had spent the first hours of 1945 letting in the new year, wishing his mates all the best, and having a few beers. After breakfast, he was crossing the runway toward the armory when he heard gunfire. Looking up the runway, he later recalled, I saw what looked like an Me-262 jet going streaking above my head. This was closely followed by several Felv 190s, and coming in the other direction were several Me-109s. I threw myself down onto the grass at the side of the runway. At Ursel in Belgium, Sergeant Peter Croist, an RAF air controller, had just reported for duty at 0900 hours. We barely had time to judge the extent of our hangovers from the night before when we heard and saw a squadron of low-flying fighters approaching. An inquiry from my CO as to whether we were expecting Spitfires was answered when I said they were not Spitfires but Focke-Wulf 190s. At numerous bases, the initial reaction was confusion. Squadron leader G. Dickinson at Knokke, Belgium, made an urgent call to headquarters as German fighters raked his field. This is January 1st, old boy, came the response. Not April 1st. Then Dickinson heard, My God, the bastards are here! And the line went dead. But at one Allied airfield, the Germans had miscalculated badly. Asch, Belgium designated Y-29 by the Americans, was home to the 352nd Fighter Group, one of the 8th Air Force's elite P-51 Mustang units. The group had been scoring heavily against the Luftwaffe for months, and on this morning, several of their pilots were already airborne, having taken off before the German attack arrived. When Jagdgeschwader 11 JG-11 roared over Asch at 0920, they found not rows of helpless aircraft on the ground, but a hornet's nest. Captain John Meyer had just climbed into his Mustang when he saw the first wave coming in. All around him, pilots were scrambling into their fighters. Some managed to get airborne even as German fighters strafed the runway. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, no relation to Captain Meyer, was in the air almost immediately. He spotted a Focke-Wulf 190 and sent it down in flames. Then another. Then a third. In the vicious low-altitude dogfight that erupted over Asch, he would claim 4 German fighters destroyed. Captain William T. Wisner got a 190 immediately after takeoff, but his Mustang was hit in the wings and oil cooler. Being over friendly territory, he later reported, I could see no reason for landing immediately, so turned toward a big dogfight. In the melee, he shot down another 190 and a 109. By this time, I saw 15 or 20 fires from crashed planes. I saw a 109 strafe at the northeast end of the strip. I started after him, and he turned into me. We made 2 head-on passes, and on the second I hit in the nose and wings. He crashed and burned east of the strip. 4 kills made Wisner one of the top scorers for the day. He would eventually total 15.5 victories in Europe and another 5.5 over Korea. Altogether, the Americans at Asch knocked down 32 German aircraft, 40% of JG-11's attacking force. The unit that was supposed to cripple American air power had instead been mauled. But at other airfields, the story was very different. At Eindhoven, 208 Luftwaffe aircraft from Jagdgeschwader 3 caught the base almost completely by surprise. Hawker Typhoons were lined up on the parkway, being prepared for missions. Flight Lieutenant Pete Wilson, the new squadron leader of No. 438 Squadron, and his No. 2 had just opened their throttles and were heading down the runway when the attack started. Both were killed before they could get airborne. German fighters swept across the field at rooftop height, their cannon and machine guns tearing into parked aircraft. Fuel tanks exploded. Ammunition cooked off. Within minutes, dozens of Typhoons were burning wrecks. The Canadian 39th Wing, which had 3 squadrons based at Eindhoven, suffered particularly heavy losses. 24 aircraft were destroyed or damaged. The visiting 124 Wing RAF lost 30 aircraft destroyed or damaged. No. 143 Wing RCAF lost 29. In total, Eindhoven was estimated to have lost at least 47 aircraft destroyed and 43 damaged, though some sources suggest the true number was higher. At Brussels-Evere, Jagdgeschwader 26 struck with devastating effect. 34 aircraft were destroyed and 29 damaged. At Brussels-Melsbrook, 35 were destroyed and 9 damaged. At Saint-Denis-Westrom, Polish Spitfire squadrons of 131 Wing had just taken off on a morning bombing mission when German fighters arrived. The returning Polish pilots found their airfield under attack and immediately engaged. Lieutenant Wacław Chojnacki of 308 Squadron had returned early due to problems with his Spitfire's bomb release mechanism. He shot down a Focke-Wulf 190, which crashed into a TOW B-17 on the airfield. But Chojnacki was totally outnumbered. He was shot down and killed. As other Spitfires returned, a massive low-level dogfight erupted, one of the last such battles of the war. The Polish pilots claimed 14 Felv 190s destroyed, but lost 2 of their own Spitfires in the combat. At some airfields, the Germans found almost nothing to attack. Grimbergen had been largely abandoned, and the attackers destroyed only half a dozen aircraft parked between the hangars. At Le Coulot in Belgium and Hiche in the Netherlands, the raids accomplished virtually nothing, but the damage was piling up. At Metz, France, the American 365th Fighter Group lost multiple P-47 Thunderbolts caught on the ground. At other bases, fuel dumps were set ablaze, hangars destroyed, control towers shot up. Smoke columns rose across the low countries as the Luftwaffe unleashed everything it had. For approximately 45 minutes, the largest German air operation since the Battle of Britain raged across northwestern Europe. At Allied bases that had been attacked, ground crews fought fires, dragged wounded comrades to safety, and watched helplessly as months of preparation went up in flames. At bases that had escaped attack, pilots scrambled into their fighters and raced toward the sound of guns. And then, almost as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. German fighters broke off their attacks and turned for home. They had expended their ammunition, their fuel was running low, and they had accomplished their mission, or so it seemed. The flight home would prove even more costly than the attack. The German fighters turned east, flying low over the winter landscape. Their formations, already scattered by combat, grew more ragged with each passing mile. Fuel gauges dropped toward empty, damaged aircraft trailed smoke, and ahead lay the most dangerous part of the entire operation, the flight back through Allied-controlled airspace to German territory. Many young German pilots had never navigated at such low altitude over unfamiliar terrain. The adrenaline of combat was fading, replaced by exhaustion and the growing realization of what they had just done. Some flew alone, separated from their formations. Others stayed together in small groups, nervously scanning the sky for Allied fighters. The Pathfinder Ju-88s that had guided them to their targets were nowhere to be seen. And then the flak began. The decision to maintain absolute secrecy about Operation Bodenplatte now exacted its price in German blood. Anti-aircraft batteries scattered across the Netherlands and Western Germany had not been informed that hundreds of friendly aircraft would be flying overhead at low altitude on the morning of January 1st. When radar operators and gun crews saw formations of aircraft approaching at 150 feet, they did what they had been trained to do. They opened fire. German 20mm and 37mm flak tore into the returning fighters. Pilots who had survived the attacks on Allied airfields and the desperate dogfights afterward now found themselves being shot down by their own defences. Some tried to gain altitude to escape the flak, making themselves easier targets. Others stayed low and jinked desperately, burning precious fuel. Aircraft crashed into Dutch and German fields. Pilots who managed to bail out found themselves surrounded by their own countrymen, furious at having been fired upon. The carnage was horrific. Hitler's Luftwaffe adjutant, Nikolaus von Below, wrote that same day. A catastrophe befell the Luftwaffe. Göring had planned a strike by almost 1,000 aircraft on the western frontier against various enemy targets. Preparations for Operation Bodenplatte were kept strictly secret. Nevertheless, the attack was greeted with heavy Allied anti-aircraft fire. On the way back, our aircraft flew over an accurate German flak, the batteries, not having been informed of the operation on the grounds of secrecy. Historians estimate that between 1/4 and 1/2 of German losses on January 1st were caused by friendly fire. Aircraft that had survived Allied defences were destroyed by their own side. Pilots who might have flown again were killed by German gunners. It was a catastrophic failure of coordination, the price of secrecy taken to suicidal extremes. But even those aircraft that survived the flak gauntlet faced new dangers. Allied fighters were now scrambling across the front. American P-51s and P-47s, British Spitfires and Tempests, roared into the sky to intercept the retreating Germans. Some caught formations before they reached German lines. Others followed them across the border, shooting down stragglers and damaged aircraft. The air battle continued through the late morning and into the afternoon. 22-year-old Alfred Michel of Jagdgeschwader 53 managed to nurse his damaged Messerschmitt Bf 109 back to German territory, only to belly land in a field where he was found by American soldiers of the 90th Infantry Division. His photograph, standing dejected beside his wrecked fighter, would become one of the iconic images of Operation Bodenplatte's failure. Second Lieutenant Theo Nibel belly-landed his Fokker-Wulf Fu-1 90D9 at Grimbergen after a bird flew into his radiator at low altitude. He became a prisoner of war. Unteroffizier Gerhard Behrens of Jagdgeschwader 1 was shot down by flying officer Tadeusz Slenkia of 308 Polish Squadron. Behrens was killed. Across the battle zone, German fighters were falling from the sky. By early afternoon, the surviving German aircraft had landed at their bases. Ground crews counted the empty dispersals. Squadron commanders checked the roster of missing pilots. The numbers were devastating. The Luftwaffe had lost approximately 271 fighters and 9 Ju-88s destroyed, with another 89 aircraft damaged. But the aircraft losses, as terrible as they were, paled in comparison to the human cost. 143 pilots were killed or missing, 70 had been captured, 21 were wounded. Among the dead were 3 Geschwaderkommandeur wing commanders, 5 Gruppenkommandeur group commanders, and 14 Staffelkapitän squadron leaders. These were not the inexperienced teenagers who had filled German fighter units in recent months. These were veteran officers, men with years of combat experience, irreplaceable leaders who had survived countless battles only to die in a single morning. Their loss would cripple the Luftwaffe's ability to train and lead the remaining pilots. Jagdgeschwader 11, which had attacked Asch, lost 28 fighters. 4 German pilots made it back to German-held territory, 2 of them wounded. 4 were captured, 20 were killed. Among the dead were pilots Günther, Specht and Horst Günther von Fassong. The unit had lost 60% of its aircraft and wouldn't be operational again until the end of January. Jagdgeschwader 27, which had struck Brussels-Melsbrook, lost 18 pilots overall. On the German side, 2nd Gruppe of Jagdgeschwader 26 lost 13 FOV 190s damaged and 2 destroyed, with 9 pilots killed or captured. 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader 26 lost 6 Bf 109s and 4 pilots. 1st Group of Jagdgeschwader 26 and 3rd Group of Jagdgeschwader 54 had attacked Grimbergen, only to discover the airfield was almost empty. They destroyed half a dozen aircraft parked between the hangars, a pittance for the cost. 5 pilots were killed, 4 went missing, and 1 was wounded. Among the dead was the commander of 11th Staffel. The group had lost around 60% of its aircraft. The carnage extended across every unit involved in the operation. Jagdgeschwader 1, Jagdgeschwader 2, Jagdgeschwader 3, Jagdgeschwader 4, Jagdgeschwader 6, Jagdgeschwader 26, Jagdgeschwader 27, Jagdgeschwader 53, Jagdgeschwader 54, Jagdgeschwader 77, all had suffered crippling losses. Many would never recover their operational effectiveness. And what had been gained? Allied losses were significant, there was no denying that. By the most conservative estimates, 305 Allied aircraft had been destroyed and 190 damaged. Some historians believe the true number may have been higher, particularly at bases where record-keeping was disrupted by the chaos of the attack. Aircraft from multiple squadrons and wings had been based at the same airfields. Visiting aircraft, damaged aircraft awaiting repair, aircraft attached directly to airfields rather than combat units, all were caught in the attack, and not all were properly recorded in loss reports. At Eindhoven alone, the damage was severe. The Canadian squadrons based there had lost heavily. Number 439 Squadron lost multiple Typhoon fighter bombers. Number 438 Squadron had lost its new squadron leader and his wingman on the runway. The British squadrons visiting the base had been mauled. Smoke from burning aircraft hung over the field for hours. But here was the fatal asymmetry that doomed Operation Bodenplatte from the start. Almost all the Allied aircraft had been destroyed on the ground. Very few Allied pilots had been killed. British personnel casualties totaled approximately 40 dead, of whom only 11 were pilots, and only 6 of those died in the air. The rest were ground crew, caught in the strafing attacks. American losses were similar. Aircraft destroyed, but pilots survived. The Allies could replace aircraft within days. By early January of 1945, American factories were producing fighters and bombers at a rate that staggered the imagination. Britain's aircraft industry, though smaller, was still churning out Spitfires, Tempests, and Typhoons. Within a week, most of the destroyed aircraft would be replaced with new machines straight from the factories. Within days, the affected squadrons would be back to full strength. but the Germans could not replace their pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By January of 1945, the Luftwaffe's training pipeline had broken down almost completely. Fuel shortages meant student pilots received minimal flight time before being sent to operational units. The best instructors had been pulled back into combat units, desperate for experienced pilots. Advanced tactical training how to survive in combat against veteran Allied pilots was virtually non-existent. Young pilots arrived at the front with perhaps 20 or 30 hours of flight time and were expected to fly against Americans and British with hundreds of hours and dozens of kills. Even before Bodenplatte, the situation had been deteriorating rapidly. In December alone, during the Ardennes offensive, the Luftwaffe had lost 500 pilots dead or missing, 194 wounded, and 35 captured. Of the dead or missing, 316 had been killed in the last 9 days of December. The losses included 2 group commanders and Major Johannes Wieser, commander of Jagdgeschwader 77. Now, in a single day, another 213 pilots had been killed or captured. More than 20 unit leaders were gone. The remaining veterans were stretched impossibly thin, trying to lead units filled with inexperienced boys while flying obsolete aircraft against Allied fighters that outperformed them in almost every way. German historian Gerhard Weinberg would later write that Operation Bodenplatte left the Germans weaker than ever and incapable of mounting any major attack again. Werner Gerbig, another German historian, was even more blunt. Operation Bodenplatte amounted to a total defeat. But in the immediate aftermath, some German commanders tried to portray the operation as a success. After all, they had destroyed nearly 500 Allied aircraft, hadn't they? The photographs of burning Typhoons at Eindhoven, destroyed Spitfires at St. Denis Westrom, shot up P-47s at Metz, these seemed to show that the Luftwaffe had struck a devastating blow. The truth became apparent within days. Allied airfields were back in operation almost immediately. Undamaged aircraft were dispersed to other bases. Damaged aircraft were repaired or written off. New aircraft arrived from Britain and were assigned to the squadrons. By January 7th, less than a week after the attack, Allied air operations had returned to their previous intensity. The Germans, by contrast, were reeling. Fighter units that had lost 60% of their aircraft couldn't fly. Squadrons without leaders couldn't operate effectively. Young pilots who had survived the mission were traumatized by the experience many had watched their squadron leaders and wingmen die. The loss of so many experienced officers meant that remaining veterans had to take on multiple leadership roles, stretching them even thinner. On January 6th, the Luftwaffe managed to fly 150 to 175 sorties to support Operation Northwind in Alsace. A far cry from the 500 sorties per day they had launched at the beginning of the Ardennes offensive. On January 14th, they suffered 139 casualties, 69 on home defence, and the rest on the Western Front. Losses included 28 of the new Focke-Wulf Fu 190D9 models. On January 16th, they put up an unexpectedly determined resistance to Allied fighter-bomber operations, but again at heavy cost. By the end of January, Hitler had lost all confidence in the ability of his fighter units to operate effectively on the Western Front. Simultaneously, the Soviet Vistula-Oder offensive had begun, directly threatening Berlin. Jagdgeschwader 1, 3, 4, 6, 11, and 77, along with 1st and 2nd Group of Jagdgeschwader 301, were ordered east to defend against the Red Army. The already weak fighter forces in the west were almost eliminated, leaving the Allies free to roam the skies over Germany. The failure of Bodenplatte also triggered another crisis, the Mutiny of the Aces, on January 22, 1945. A group of Germany's top fighter pilots, led by Colonel Johannes Mackie Steinhoff and including such legends as Günther Lützow and Gerhard Barkhorn, confronted Göring about the disastrous leadership of the Luftwaffe. They blamed him for Operation Bodenplatte's failure. for the senseless waste of pilots and aircraft, for the continued appointment of incompetent officers to critical positions. Goering's response was predictable. He accused them of cowardice and defeatism. Adolf Galland, the General der Jagdflieger General of Fighter Forces, who had originally opposed Bodenplatte in favor of his own great blow strategy, was removed from his position. The mutiny accomplished nothing except to further demoralize the remaining fighter force. Galland later wrote, "The Luftwaffe received its death blow at the Ardennes offensive. In unfamiliar conditions and with insufficient training and combat experience, our numerical strength had no effect. It was decimated while in transfer, on the ground, in large air battles, especially during Christmas, and was finally destroyed." Operation Ground Slab was the conclusion of this tragic chapter. In the early morning of January 1st, 1945, every aircraft took off. And almost none of those aircraft made any difference to the war's outcome. The sky over Germany in the weeks following Operation Bodenplatte belonged to the Allies. With German fighter forces shattered and increasingly transferred east to face the Red Army, American and British aircraft operated with virtual impunity. The strategic bombing campaign, which had been systematically destroying German industrial capacity for months, now intensified beyond anything previously seen. In February of 1945, the Allies launched Big Week, a coordinated bombing offensive targeting German fighter production facilities. Although the Luftwaffe tried to defend, the losses were catastrophic. Over 700 Messerschmitt Bf-109s had been destroyed in the air or in factories. Almost all twin-engine fighters were gone. Production of Junkers Ju-88 was cut by 50%. 75% of the factories had been damaged or destroyed. During Big Week, American fighter pilots destroyed 17% of the Luftwaffe's remaining experienced fighter pilots in air-to-air combat. The bombing campaign expanded to target oil production, which had already been severely depleted. German petroleum production dropped by over 90%. Fighters sat on the ground, unable to fly for lack of fuel. When they did fly, pilots had to husband every drop, limiting their ability to maneuver in combat or pursue Allied aircraft. On March 11, 1945, the Royal Air Force reduced much of the city of Essen to rubble when 1,079 British aircraft dropped over 4,700 tons of bombs. On March 12, 1,108 aircraft, 748 Lancasters, 292 Halifaxes, and 68 de Havilland Mosquitoes attacked Dortmund in what would be the single largest bombing raid on one target in the entire war. More than 4,800 tons of bombs destroyed 98% of the city's buildings. On March 18th, the United States 8th Air Force launched its largest raid on Berlin. More than 1,300 heavy bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters. The Luftwaffe tried to defend. Me-262 jets scrambled to intercept the bomber formations in what would be the largest attack by jet and piston engine fighters against Allied bombers during the entire war. They shot down 24 bombers and 6 fighters. But the Germans lost just 3 pilots. Almost all the losses were jets, destroyed by the escorts or by anti-aircraft fire during landing approaches. More than 3,000 tons of bombs fell on Berlin. By March to April of 1945, Allied fighter patrols had perfected the tactic of destroying German aircraft on the ground. P-51s, P-47s, Tempests, and Spitfires ranged across Germany, attacking any airfield where German aircraft might be found. Luftwaffe jets, the Me-262, that represented Germany's last technological hope, were particularly vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Allied fighters patrolled known jet bases, waiting for the jets to come in with their fuel low and their speed reduced. The Germans tried to counter with extensive flak alleys, corridors of anti-aircraft guns to protect their jet bases. At Rhine over 150 emplacements of 20mm flak-Vierling quadruple autocannon batteries protected the approaches. But even this wasn't enough. British Tempest wings lost 7 aircraft in a week attacking Hopston before they discontinued the rat scramble tactic, but by then numerous jets had been destroyed on their landing approaches. German airfields became death traps. Allied fighter bombers attacked with 500-pound bombs, unguided rockets, and 50-caliber machine guns. Aircraft caught on the ground were strafed to destruction. Hangars were set ablaze. Fuel dumps exploded. Any German pilot who tried to take off faced a gauntlet of fire. At the secret jet base at Giebelstadt, which the Luftwaffe had tried desperately to hide by painting the runway to resemble a grassy field complete with white sheep, Allied attacks between September of 1944 and March of 1945 gradually destroyed the facility. Legend has it the airfield was only discovered when an Allied photo interpreter noticed that the painted sheep never moved between successive reconnaissance photos. Medium bombers and attack aircraft pounded Giebelstadt with bombs and rockets. When American forces captured the base at the end of March, they found the burned-out hulks of numerous aircraft that fleeing German forces had destroyed to prevent their capture. This pattern repeated across Germany. As Allied ground forces advanced from both east and west, German airfields were either bombed into uselessness or abandoned. Flyable aircraft were evacuated to bases further in the interior. Aircraft that couldn't fly were destroyed. The Luftwaffe's operational space shrank daily. By April of 1945, the German fighter force was a shell. Units that still existed on paper had no aircraft or no fuel to fly them. Pilots who survived had nowhere to operate from. The defense of German airspace during Operation Plunder and Operation Varsity, the Allied crossing of the Rhine River on March 24, was negligible. On that day, nearly 20,000 Allied paratroopers and glider troops landed in the largest airborne operation in history. The Luftwaffe was barely able to contest the operation. In the remaining 17 weeks of the war, after Operation Bodenplatte, the Jagdwaffe, the fighter force, struggled to recover sufficiently to remain effective. They never did. The 213 pilots lost on January 1, 1945, particularly the veteran officers and formation leaders, could not be replaced. The carefully hoarded fighter resources that Goering had assembled over months had been squandered in a single morning. The mathematics of the operation told the story starkly. The Germans had destroyed, at most, 500 Allied aircraft. They had lost approximately 270 aircraft. In purely numerical terms, this seemed like a victory. They had destroyed more than they lost. But the exchange rate in pilots was catastrophic. The Allies lost perhaps 20 pilots killed. The Germans lost over 200 killed or captured. Moreover, the Germans had lost their aircraft in combat, their pilots dead, captured, or wounded. The Allies had lost their aircraft on the ground, their pilots alive and ready to fly again as soon as new aircraft arrived. Within days, the Allied squadrons were back to strength. Many German units never recovered. The strategic calculus was even worse. The Germans had expended their last reserves of fuel and pilots for a handful of burned aircraft that were replaced within a week. The Allies, meanwhile, continued to operate at full strength, bombing German cities and industrial targets, destroying transportation, networks, and establishing complete air superiority that enabled their ground forces to advance virtually unhindered. Adolf Galland, reflecting on the operation years later, said, "We have sacrificed our last substance." On April 18, 1945, all flyable aircraft at Stade Airfield were evacuated to Uetersen. The remainder, and all the facilities, were destroyed by their own crews. On May 1, British forces occupied Stade and found evidence of the Germans' desperate final evacuation. On May 8, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. The Luftwaffe, which had terrorized Europe in 1940, which had pioneered tactical air support and demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of combined arms warfare, which had developed the world's first operational jet fighter, this same Luftwaffe, had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force months earlier. And the beginning of the end, the moment when the Luftwaffe's death became inevitable, was the cold morning of January 1, 1945, when Hermann Goering gambled everything on Operation Bodenplatte. In the years since, historians have debated endlessly what might have happened if the operation had been executed differently. What if Gallen's great blow strategy had been adopted, instead massing fighters to attack a single American bomber raid and shooting down 400 or 500 B-17s in one devastating blow? What if Operation Bodenplatte had been launched on December 16th as originally planned, before the Luftwaffe had been bled by 3 weeks of Ardennes fighting? What if German anti-aircraft batteries had been properly informed, preventing the friendly fire that destroyed so many returning aircraft? But these questions miss the fundamental reality. By January of 1945, Germany had already lost the air war. The Allies had too many aircraft, too many pilots, too much industrial capacity, and too much fuel. The Luftwaffe was outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outflown by better-trained Allied pilots in aircraft that were at least equal to German machines. Operation Bodenplatte didn't lose the air war for Germany, that war was already lost. What Bodenplatte did was ensure that the Luftwaffe couldn't even contest control of the air during the war's final months. It transformed a gradually deteriorating situation into immediate collapse. The young pilot Werner Mulge, who had marvelled at 50 Focke-Wulf fighters lined up in the moonlight on the morning of January 1st, survived the war. In later years, he described Operation Bodenplatte as he remembered it, a massive effort that achieved tactical surprise, destroyed many Allied aircraft, and accomplished its immediate objectives. But then he always added the same conclusion: it didn't matter. The aircraft were replaced, the airfields were back in operation, and hundreds of German pilots who might have defended their homeland in the desperate final months were dead. 22-year-old Alfred Michel, photographed standing beside his crashed Messerschmitt in the custody of American soldiers, became one of the visual symbols of the operation's failure. His dejected expression captured the reality that many German pilots felt but couldn't articulate. They had flown their mission, followed their orders, and achieved surprise. And it had all been for nothing. The Allied airmen who survived January 1st, 1945, went on to fly many more missions. They bombed Berlin and Dresden, destroyed German transportation networks, supported the Rhine crossings, and escorted bombers deep into what remained of the Third Reich. Some were shot down in the war's final weeks. Many survived to tell their stories. The German pilots who survived Operation Bodenplatte had a different trajectory. Those who weren't transferred east to face the Red Army spent the final months of the war with inadequate fuel, inferior numbers, and the knowledge that every mission might be their last. Some died defending their homeland against impossible odds. Others survived to become prisoners of war. A few managed to evade capture until Germany's surrender. But on the morning of January 1st, 1945, standing beside their aircraft in the pre-dawn darkness, none of them knew what was coming. They thought they were launching the operation that would save the Third Reich's ground offensive. They believed they would destroy Allied air power and give Germany one last chance. Instead, they were flying to the funeral of the Luftwaffe itself. The sky over Germany in January of 1945 was cold and clear. By May, it belonged entirely to the Allies. And the transformation from one to the other, from contested airspace to complete Allied dominance, took just 17 weeks. Operation Bodenplatte was both the beginning and the end. It was the last time the Luftwaffe could mass nearly 1,000 fighters for a coordinated operation. And it was the first day of the final countdown to Germany's defeat. The 6 days between the failed Ardennes offensive and Operation Bodenplatte had been the Luftwaffe's last chance to husband its resources, to preserve its pilots for a more strategic blow, to defend German airspace in the months ahead. Instead, Goering chose to gamble. And on January 1st, 1945, that gamble failed. By the time Allied fighters were systematically destroying German aircraft on the ground in March and April, strafing airfields, catching jets on landing approach, bombing hangars, the Luftwaffe no longer had the pilots or the fuel to defend itself. Those pilots were gone, lost in the desperate gamble of New Year's Day. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.